Welcome to Casual Friday. I have project updates on my two sweaters, really more about the project setbacks I'm experiencing. Then I have some knitting history updates, some material I want to share with you that I have been finding very interesting this past week. And then I want to talk about the gifts that knitters can give to each other. That is, what they can do for each other or give to each other that has to do with their knitting. And I don't mean what you can buy for somebody. So as I was preparing to film, I was trying to decide whether I was going to talk about the setback that I'm experiencing on my Aran sweater, or if I want to show you the progress that I've been making on my Edwardian sweater. So I was putting the Edwardian sweater on my little dress form, and I realized that I'd made a horrible mistake. When I started these two sweaters I've been working on, my Edwardian sweater and the Aran cabled sweater, both of them were using worsted weight yarn. And the Edwardian sweater, I was going to be knitting in a standard worsted weight gauge of 5 stitches per inch. But with the cabled sweater, I wanted to work at a firmer gauge so that the weight of the cables could be held up by the firmness, and also that would help over time with pilling. It wouldn't pill as much. So that was my plan. That was how I was swatching with some lighter colored yarn. And then once I determined what stitch patterns I wanted, then I swatched with the yarn I was really going to use for my sweater. And I've talked in the past about why I did that. Part of it was that the yarn is so dark that it was easier for me to swatch and establish stitch patterns when it was in a light color, and also because I hadn't really bought extra of the yarn I was going to use for the sweater. So I wanted to do all my experimenting in a yarn that wasn't worried about using up or having to rip out and use in the sweater later. So that's that. So while I was swatching for the Aran sweater using a size 4 needle, I was actually knitting my Edwardian sweater on a size 6. And I got to a point where I was had finished the back of the Edwardian sweater and had come over the shoulder, and I'd finished the front, and so it was off the needles at that time. When I did the real swatch for my Aran sweater, it came out a little bit wider than I expected. I thought there might be some difference between the light colored yarn I was swatching with and the sweater I was going to use for my Aran, but I was kind of surprised at how much of a difference there was. But I accommodated for it, and I made some changes, took some stitches out here and put them in over there, and it got it all worked out. So I got to the end of the first skein on the Aran sweater, which you probably won't be able to see. Well, maybe you can see. So I got to the end of the first skein, and I set it to the side, and I thought, well, I'm going to just wash it and let it in and see how it blocks out to confirm row gauge and confirm it's going to be the width I want it to be, so that when I hit the armholes, I'll know that it's going to be the length I want. I do this with sweaters a lot. I get to a certain point and I just wash what I have just to confirm that I'm going to get what I think I'm going to get. So I was sitting on my desk with the needles in it, and I decided I'm going to switch back to working on the Edwardian sweater, where I have some live stitches on waste yarn, and so I need to put them back on the needle. And so I reached for the other interchangeable circular needle on my desk that I assumed was the size 6. I picked it up and I said, well, gee, this seems a little small for a 6. I wonder if it's a 5, like if I didn't put my 5 away. So I got the needle gauge out and I measured it. It was a size 4, which meant that I wasn't using the size 4 to knit the Aran sweater. So I measured the needle on the Aran sweater, and that was a 6. So I'd been knitting it with a 6. And I compared the knitting to my swatch using the yarn, the real yarn for the Aran, and I could tell that they were pretty much the same. So I think what happened was I did my swatching with the light colored yarn on a size 4, and then when I went to do swatching with the real yarn to confirm my gauge, I used the size 6, which is why it ended up wider than I expected. And instead of checking my needle, I just adjusted for it. I just assumed I was using the correct needle, and I just carried on. But what that also means is that instead of using a needle 2 sizes smaller for the ribbing, I ended up using one that was 4 sizes smaller. So what I have to do, and it's stretching out wide enough, but the reason I wanted to knit the Aran sweater on a size 4 had to do with the firmness of the fabric and pilling. So now I have this problem to solve. Do I carry on with the size 6? Because I have the gauge established for that. And then when I do the front, I will use the size 4 for the ribbing. Just go ahead and leave the slightly firmer ribbing on the back. Do I do that? Do I try to re-knit the ribbing on a size 4 and somehow graft it to the bottom, which sounds really unappealing to me? Or do I rip it all out, redo the gauge swatch on the real size 4 needle so I know what my gauge actually should be, and then re-knit this whole thing? So that's what I have been thinking about this week as I've been working once again on my Edwardian sweater on my size 6 needles, which are correct for the Edwardian sweater. So that's the setback in the Aran sweater, and I think my choice is going to be to continue on and see what happens with the sweater. It is what it is. I just don't know that I have it in me to rip out and redo everything from scratch. I just don't think I have it in me. So I've been working on this Edwardian sweater. If you remember, this is the part I had done before. I'd done the back all the way over into, this is the right front. And the right front, when you get past the neck, you have to cast on as many stitches as you need, that's just as wide as the back. So it comes all the way over. And then, after you have worked a certain amount of time, then you cast on about 4 inches worth of stitches to create the underarm area here. So when you work the left side, you do the opposite. You cast on enough stitches in this direction to be just as wide as the back is. And then when you get down to about this part, then you cast on for the underarm on this side. And that's what I was doing. This was sitting on my lap, and this wants to flip inside and out a lot. And I never once put this back on the model, up on the dress form, to make sure I'd done it right. So I was putting it on today, and look what I did. I cast on all the stitches I needed for the left front, but when I went to do the underarm, I cast on over here instead of over here. So I have to rip out all of this that I've knit in the past couple of days in order to cast on the underarm again. I should have realized, because I've been keeping, this, I've got these markers on here that's helping me keep track of how many repeats I'm working, and it's at the armhole edge, but for whatever reason I cast on at the wrong side, which is not happy news. This is the kind of thing that usually happens to me at some point in the project. There's some point where I make some kind of mistake that I have to rip a section back. When I make just little individual errors, like, oh, I did the decrease in the wrong place, or I miscrossed a cable, those I can ladder down and just fix those stitches. But something like this has to be, there's no way to ladder down and fix that. I have to rip back and rip that out. So that's not uncommon for something like that to happen in a large project like this. What is uncommon for me is for me to be working in parallel on 2 different projects like this, going back and forth, and then have so to have the bonehead mistake of each project occur at the same time is a little discouraging, but it's knitting. I can handle it. So I've been on this knitting history kick since I first found that pattern for that Edwardian sweater and decided to knit it. And I've become very curious about sort of the history of sweaters from the late 19th century on, and how sweater shapes and construction has changed. I've been looking for more and more information wherever I can find it. So in an effort to understand more about historical knitting, I have joined 2 Ravelry groups. One's called Historic Knitting, which is very interesting, and another was All Things Vintage. So through those two groups, I found out about a couple of different publications, and so I ordered them, and have been waiting for them to come. Some of them, one I'm still waiting for, but I did get a couple of different publications this week, and I also continued looking online. And one of the first things I found earlier this week was an article on the evolution of knitwear that was published. It's a scholarly article. I'll put a link down in the description. So I knew a lot of early knitting was focused on stockings, but I tended to think about that in terms of stockings like for that women who are wearing long skirts were wearing, or that men with their various length of like pantaloons or knee breeches or different things, how those were kind of for show. And I hadn't really thought about what the effect of men's trouser hemlines, how that would affect the knitting industry in sort of, and how they had to react to that. So that's really interesting in that article. But they also talk quite a bit about 20th century hosiery and the challenges that behind trying to make shaped stockings, which they'd been able to do for a long time, that weren't seamed. So to make a seamless shaped stocking by machine was a challenge. So that was really interesting to me to read about that. But also some of the things I've been wondering about in terms of the influences of fashion and machine knitting on hand knitting were addressed in that article to some extent. So again, there's a link down in the description. So when I started speculating a couple of weeks ago about how sweater construction looks like it was probably the 1920s when fashions were really changing and knitwear was being used for fashion, like fine gauge knitwear. I was wondering, at what point the transition, like what was the transition of how sweaters were constructed, instead of starting at the back and coming over the shoulders and down the front and then adding the sleeves later. When did they really start using dressmaker shaping and knitting in separate pieces and doing all that? And I could see that by the end of the 20s that was happening, but I was wondering, what the evolution was. And so I ordered a reproduction of a 1920s knitting book that has 23 different sweater patterns in it. It's this Fleischer was one of the nice knitting pattern books, and so these are patterns that are in the public domain, and this person has done scanning and she's reproducing them as hard copy, not as digital copies, but as hard copy, and she does a really nice job. But I wasn't really sure what was going to be going on in the patterns and the construction. And what I saw was that in one of these patterns, out of 23, one of them did have the sweater knit front and back separately, and the back had shoulder shaping, only the back. Shoulders had shoulder shaping, the front did not, which I thought was interesting. So so my plan when I'm done with the Edwardian sweater, which again I will try on, but probably I can't see myself actually wearing. I want to knit a couple of different 1920s sweaters when this transition period of construction was going on. For sure, there's one that I'm thinking of that I want to knit that has a lot of really unusual, like very specific dressmaking shaping, especially in the front arm side. They don't have the armhole shaping the same on the front and the back, and that's really intriguing. I've been trying to understand more about what's going on with that, and so I'm probably going to do that. So I think later this year I'll be knitting some more historical vintage sweater patterns, starting with something from here. Oh, and the person who does this, she has an Etsy shop. It's called Ivy Rose, and she's got a lot of different reproductions. And now as I'm learning more about who the good pattern makers were, I can kind of focus a little bit more about what other pattern books I might want to buy. So in the historic knitting group, somebody posted in December that there's this annual archaeological textiles review. So it's a journal. It's a scholarly journal. It comes out once a year. This was going to be the first year. It was going to focus. The entire issue is going to be about knitting, and this is really unusual in textiles. They don't focus much on knitting, and often when they do, they use more colloquial terms. It hasn't been given the kind of attention that, say, weaving has gotten. And so this issue, it's number 60 of the Archaeological Textiles Review. It's published in Copenhagen, Denmark, but it is in English. A lot of scholarly writing is done in English, even if it's published in other countries, which is convenient for me since I don't speak any of those other languages. And so I finally received this in the mail today, and I'll put a link down below on this as well. It's in kroner. You buy it in Danish kroner, but I think it came out to about $32 US. And what I've noticed on their website is that previous textile journals have been digitized and you can read them as PDFs, but if you actually want the hard copy, you have to order it. So whether or not they have copies left, I don't know. And when you buy it, it looks like you're getting a subscription, but since it's only one issue, your subscription is for this one issue. I've been reading it. It's really interesting to me. One of the things that they do in here is establish the terminology that's going to be used to describe knitted articles in sort of archaeological terms. So in knitting, we have more colloquial terms, and every language and different regions will use different terms for them, and some of them can make things more confusing or can be made more clear depending on what language it comes from. But a lot of terms are used, like knitting is used as a verb, as a noun, as a description of the finished product, and that's what they're trying to eliminate. So they call it knit work when we're talking about something in progress or that's completed. It's called knit work, and they specify when they use the word stitch versus when they use something else. Because when we talk about a pattern, we might be talking about how you're combining knits and purls to create a particular look, or we might be talking about the instructions in order to make something. And that can be confusing terms that we use when we're talking to each other as knitters. Another thing that can be very confusing, especially in English, is talking about the right side of the work versus the right edge of the work. And it can get even more confusing when you're talking about a right front, and it's the right front as worn. So you could have the right edge of the right side of the right front of a work, and that can get very confusing. So they're using archaeological terms like recto and verso. So recto means what we would call the right side of the work, the public side of the work, and then there's verso would be the reverse side, the back side of the work. So they're laying out how archaeologists are to talk about knitted work in order to describe it to people who may not be knitters. So, and it's not in order to get instructions for how to knit this, but it's in order to understand how this was constructed and which face of the fabric you're seeing and what type of stitches were used and that sort of thing. So they have that first article, and then they have some other articles that use this new method of approaching a description of knitwear. And they say, for example, there have been a few scholarly articles written in the 20th century about certain collections of knitting that are in these museums, and they use colloquial terms, or they didn't describe them fully, or they described them in confusing ways. And so here's how we would describe those particular things that have been described in the past. Here's how we would do that. So you can compare how it was described in the past and how we should describe it now. So they have, and so some of the things that they're talking about in here are pieces of knitwear that are really old, like from the 16th century. So some of the knitting was found in, it was a shipwreck, and they know the ship went down in like 1545, for example. So they know that that was knitting that was being used at that time. And they're looking, and they have stockings that were all found in underground. They've been underground for 300 years in a particular area of London, and may or may not have all been knit by the same person, or may have been knit by the same community of knitters. And they're not going to describe how all knitting was done this way. They can only describe these particular things and how they were constructed. So it's interesting to see, and they tell you the gauge, but they're not calling it the gauge. They're talking about how many whales. So how many whales there are, which is columns of stitches, and how many courses, which is how many rows or rounds. So they use the word course to talk about a horizontal section of knitting without saying whether it was done in the round or flat, because often they can't determine that because it's a fragment. It's not something that's complete. So it's really, this is the kind of thing, like, this is like, oh, I got so excited when it came in the mail, and I've been reading these articles, a couple of them per day. So if that's something you're interested in, I'll put a link down there as well. So one of the first books I ordered, I'm not sure where I heard about this. I think this may have come from somebody who may have mentioned it in one of the comments back in December when I was first getting interested in the historic knitting and trying to find resources that could give me timelines about how things. And the book is by a woman named Sandy Black. She is a professor of textiles in the UK, and she wrote a book called Knitting, Fashion Industry and Craft. And this is a hefty book, and I got it yesterday afternoon, so I've been looking at a few things, but it has a lot of great information in here that really, and pictures of different types of machines or equipment that were used by knitters. Like, I'd heard of the stocking frame before, and that had been invented. I didn't understand that they were knitting stockings flat and shaping them on a stocking frame. And then seaming them. I, for some reason, thought that a stocking frame was a circular device. They did come up with circular knitting machines over time. It just helped me understand more what the technology was like at different points in time, and how much manual work was still involved in a lot of these machines that were being operated by people. Still made it a lot faster to knit, but it was still a lot more labor intensive than maybe I'd been aware of. So this is a book that's really interesting, and again, I'll leave a link down below in case you're interested in that. So as a knitter, it's very likely that nobody ever gives you a hand knit gift. I know that that's true for me. One time I was given a hand knit gift, and it was from my oldest daughter. She was in middle school, and they had clubs once a week at school, and she had signed up with some of her friends in 6th grade to be in knitting club. And so the teacher taught them how to knit, which is just as well. It wouldn't have worked for me to teach either of my girls to knit. That would not have been a happy time for any of us. So she was being taught to knit, and she came to me and she wanted to knit a holiday gift for her Nana. And her idea was that she wanted to knit a little, like a phone cozy. This is, 10 years ago probably, so it was when our cell phones were a lot smaller. So she wanted to knit a little phone cozy for her Nana. And I just thought that was so sweet. And so we were talking about, well, what stitch patterns could she use, and what she could use knit to, purl to, because then that would stretch and it wouldn't roll up or anything. And figured out, well, how wide should it be, and then how long it should be, and she said, how am I going to know if it's the right size? I'm like, well, I'll get my phone and we can, make sure that it's going to fit. And I just thought, oh my gosh, her Nana is just going to love this. It turned out that she was knitting it for me, and I was like so thrilled. And really, that's the only thing my daughter has ever knit. She gave up on knitting after that. She wasn't interested, but she knit this for me, and I used it. I didn't need one, but I used it. I had it in my purse. I always put my phone back in it, and I would show it to anybody. I was just thrilled. It's the only hand knit gift I have ever received, and it was thrilled. And most of the time, I don't think it doesn't bother me that nobody knits for me, because I get so much out of the process of knitting. I really enjoy it. There's two aspects of knitting for me. One is the process of knitting, how much I enjoy it, and then if I'm knitting for somebody else, I get that pleasure about thinking about them while I'm knitting, and then I get to give it to them, and they, as a symbol of my love for them, that hopefully they understand that this is me presenting my love to you in a knitted item. So I think they all get that. But so there's sort of those two aspects of it. So giving a knitter a knitted gift you understand the thought and the effort behind it, but it can also sort of take the fun out of it for you. Like, oh, if I really wanted that hat, I would want to knit it for myself. But sometimes there are things as a knitter that you want, you're like, oh, I would never want to knit that for myself. And so that could be really delightful if somebody would want to knit it for you. That could be really nice. And I know some knitters, they have like a sister or best friend and they both knit and they say, oh, we both want to knit this sweater. I'll knit this one for you and you can knit that for me. And then you have that kind of really wonderful exchange if you happen to both want the same kind of sweater. I mean, it can work out, but it often doesn't. But one of the things about knitters, or anybody who does any sort of textile craft, is that usually that's not the only textile craft they do. Everybody has their own reasons for wanting to knit or do other textile crafts, and many knitters do have more than one textile craft. A lot of them sew, some of them weave or spin or dye or do crochet or tatting, or it's just like if you get involved in textiles in one way, you tend to spread out in other ways as well. It's just really common to go to a knitting group and then just discover, oh, that person sews and that person does this and that person does that, and you can find out a little bit more about that activity from them, whether or not you're interested in doing it yourself. And I really like going to knitting groups because I can talk about my knitting with other knitters, and it's people who are interested in what I'm doing, and I'm interested in what they're doing, and oh, did you see this new yarn? This is so cool, or look at this new pattern, this is so great. And it's people who appreciate what you were doing on a different level than the recipient of the gift. They're just as interested in the process of knitting as you are, and that's what you're sharing with them. So I really love this knitting group that I've been going to since October. I went to a retreat, a weaver's retreat, and I met this couple, and they said, oh, you should come to this knitting group. It's at the library on Wednesdays mornings, and we would love to have you. And so I started going, and I've been really delighted with it. So when I go to knitting group, whoever I'm sitting next to, I'm interested to see what are they knitting, and I kind of look around, what are other people knitting. Sometimes people, if they finished something that week, they pass it around so everybody can see it. Last week, a woman came over to me and said, I have these 2 balls of kind of a mohair blend, and I'm thinking maybe I would want to do a scarf with a ruffle on it. Do you think that would work? Do you think I have enough to do this thing? And so we talked about, what size would be and how she could kind of gauge, whether or not it was going to work, and what length of scarf it was probably going to work out for her. And she's like, okay, and she, she knew what she wanted to do, and she didn't need me to tell her what to do. She just, using me as a sounding board. And so this week she came over and she showed me, oh, look, I started working on that scarf we talked about, and she had it halfway done already. It was really beautiful. It was really soft, and so it was really fun to see that, that what came out of that discussion, and now she's got something. So then this woman stood up, and she had, 5 or 6 zippered project bags that were each about this big. So they were small project bags, but they're big enough for like carrying socks or a shawl or something like that, like a single skein type of project. And each one of them was sort of a neutral, like a slate gray type of color. There was some variation in that, but they were these kind of dark neutral colors, and they had like red machine stitching that had been like machine embroidered and just kind of like wavy designs or whatever. And each one of them had a little like patch on the front, like a logo patch. And she was showing them to us, and what they were was her father had died. I don't know if it was recently or in the past number of years, but when he had retired, he started working at a hardware store. So he had all these coveralls, these kind of lined coveralls that had his name on them, and then they would have different patches of different hardware suppliers on them. And she didn't want to throw them away. They had a lot of meaning to her, but she didn't know what she was going to do with these coveralls. And one of the other women in the knitting group took them and turned them into these knitting project bags. And so on the front of each of them is one of those little patches. And the lining on them is this red, beautiful red quilted fabric, which was the original lining of these coveralls. And that was why she was using the red thread on the outside. And I thought, oh my gosh, what a wonderful gift to be able to give to another textile crafter that like it was just, it's a useful thing. It has sentimental value. It's a gift that friend could give to her that she couldn't do for herself and maybe wouldn't have wanted to do for herself. And I thought, oh my gosh, that was just so wonderful. Well, the woman sitting next to me, she sat down, and I've sat next to her a few times. She's a really good knitter, really interesting person. And she was showing me the mitten that she'd been knitting. It was from some kind of historic pattern of some sort. It was beautiful blue color, like a Wedgwood blue color. And then it had this design that was in white, this kind of delicate geometrical design, kind of making little diamond patterns across the mitten. And it had a nice halo. I said, oh, is that Angora? And she's like, yeah, it's really, really beautiful. And so I started looking at the mitten, and I'm always interested in thumb gussets because there's a lot of different ways to construct them. And I was interested because this had this stitch pattern on there, and I was looking at the thumb, and I thought, well, I wonder how they did that, because the stitch pattern was completely maintained but it was obvious that there was a thumb gusset where stitches had increased, and I was trying to puzzle it out, and she said, you know what, this thumb gusset is so interesting. She proceeded to tell me how it was done. It was in a way I'd never heard it before, and I could just hear how excited she was about it, and I was excited too, because it was something I'd never seen before, and it was really a fun interaction. It was, the thing that I love most about going to this knitting group. But after we had seen the women talking about these project bags, she said to me, do you remember years ago coming to General Mills and teaching a class to the knitting group there? And I did remember, I had to look up when it was 2010, but I was so dumbfounded that she knew about that and that she was bringing it up. I was trying to just get my head around that. And I thought, she had been looking familiar to me, but she's a member of the guild, and I thought I've probably seen her at the guild. I've in yarn over. There's a lot of the knitting events. If you're really, into knitting, you see people without necessarily knowing them, and they start to look familiar. So I was just trying to get my head around the fact that she had known me previous to this knitting group, or had met me, or had interacted with me in some way, and I was just trying to get my head around that. And she said, do you remember the woman, Karen, who ran that group? And I said, oh yeah, absolutely remember her. And she was a really interesting woman. General Mills is a huge company here, and they have their headquarters here, and they have this very large campus of buildings. And so she invited me to teach at their spring retreat, which was on a weekend. And it was an all-day thing, and that was what I was teaching there for. But she took me on a tour around there. She said, we have this knitting group. They meet once a week on Tuesdays in General Mills, and we have this whole closet full of yarn that can be, we do a lot of charity knitting. So if somebody wants to do a charity project, they can use the yarn, and General Mills gives us a budget every year, and so they help supply that. And I thought, that is just fantastic organization. And there were tons of knitters who were in this group. Some learned to knit there, and some of them were just really experienced knitters. And I vividly remember, more than I remember what I was actually teaching. I know what I taught there, but I remember Karen and her telling me about this knitting program that they had at General Mills, probably more than anything else from that day. So the woman next to me said, she died a couple of years ago, which I couldn't believe, because she wasn't that old. She had ovarian cancer. And she said, how when someone gets sick and you want to help them, but you don't really know what to do, and you really can't ask them, well, what do you want me to do for you? Because when somebody is sick, they're dealing with that. They don't need to take responsibility for explaining it to everybody what you can do for me. So she said, so we didn't know what to do for her. So she did a lot of charity knitting. So we asked her, would she like us to finish her charity projects? And she was so happy about that. And I thought, oh my gosh, that is such an amazing thing to do. So I haven't really done much charity knitting. I've done a small amount of it, and it was for a very specific group. So, but I thought what a kind thing to do for a friend who couldn't do it anymore, and how it was so important to her, and she had all these unfinished things. So she said, yeah, we went to her house. She had like 3 rooms. She's a very avid knitter. She had like 3 rooms full of all kinds of stuff. And we went through it. We kind of doled it all out. So we each took some different things. And she was really happy about that. And she said, but recently her husband contacted us. And he still has some things he's trying to figure out what to do with. She's like, I wonder if you might be able to help with this. She said, the first thing, she said, is a scarf. It was halfway finished, and so one skein of yarn had been completed, and there's one more skein to go. It's for the red scarf project. And I was like, oh, I know that's the charity I have knit for, that I was really, like, when I found out about it, I'm like, I have to do something about this. It's the one charity I have actually felt driven to knit for. She said, but the problem is that the pattern isn't with the yarn, so we don't know what it is. And we looked on her Ravelry project pages, and we figured out what the pattern was, but it's no longer available because the woman who designed it has died, and so it's no longer available for download. And she said, so we're not sure what to do with that. We could rip it out and then re-knit something else. I'm like, no, it's halfway done. I said, I bet you anything I could reverse engineer. I bet you anything I could. She's like, okay, great. She goes, now the next thing she said was a personal project of Karen's. She always wanted a black sweater. And she was working on a sweater for herself, and that was a Gansey, but it was one that was sort of knit to fit, and it was for some sort of online thing. Would you know what that might have been? And I said, well, it wasn't on Ravelry. She said, no. And I said, well, I was thinking about Ganseys, like who would be the likely, famous Gansey designer who would be likely to have run something like that, and how would they have done it? And I said, well, I used to be a member of several Yahoo email groups, like for socks and things like that. And for knit along on, I did a sweater knit along on there. So it might have been a Yahoo group. So maybe there's some way to track down what the Yahoo group was. And I said, but she's like, it's a lot of really complex patterns. So we don't have the pattern. We don't know what it is. And it wasn't in her Ravelry projects, this Karen's Ravelry project. So they didn't know what it was called. They didn't know how to figure it out. I said, well, bring it in. If the stitch patterns are established, it could probably be finished. And so that night I went on to Karen's, the woman who died, went on to her Ravelry project pages, and I found the red scarf, and I saw what it was called, and I said, oh, for sure, I could chart this out. That's not going to be any problem at all. And she said, well, we looked at the sweater again, and what we can see is that it was knit top down, which instantly made me go, well, that's not a Gansey. She said it was top down, a lot of cables. It was a cardigan, again, not a Gansey. And she said the sleeves are done, and it's done down to the armholes, and so just like the body would need to be knit down, and then the button bands. And I said, I think that's the Follow the Leader Aran knit along. I think that's a sweater that I've already knit. She goes, oh, do you have the pattern? I said, well, I have it's a guided tour through it, but the stitch patterns are established, so it can be done. But I just thought that was the most amazing set of circumstances surrounding those 2 particular projects that she was asking for help with, like, what do we do about these patterns, because I think that's what she was driving at by asking me this, like, how do we figure out what these patterns are? Do you have any idea what they might be? She wasn't asking me to knit them. She was asking me, do you know how we could figure this out? So I'm not sure that I'm going to be the one to finish this black sweater, because I have the hardest time knitting with black yarn. I'm having a hard enough time with my own Aran cardigan with the natural black yarn, but well, I think like most people, I have to have a motivation in order to do something. There has to be something that drives me to do something. And there's so many different things in knitting and so many ways of focusing yourself in knitting. Some people focus on only knitting for themselves. Some people focus only on doing charity knitting, and most people mix it up in some way or another. But regardless, I have to have some sort of motivation for knitting something. So if I have somebody like a niece or nephew who says, well, for my wedding gift, I want you to knit me a blanket. Okay, so then the motivation there is that they are my niece or nephew and I will knit for them, even if it means knitting them a blanket, where normally I wouldn't want to knit a blanket for them. So I have to have a motivation for doing something. And I think that finishing another knitter's projects is a really sort of personal, it's a way to get me that personal motivation. And especially when one of these projects is like the one type of charity knitting I actually felt motivated to do, like actually didn't just go, oh, I really ought to do that, but I actually followed through and did it a number of times. And that's the Red Scarf Project. So the Red Scarf Project is part of this organization that helps kids who have aged out of the foster care system and are going to college. So once a kid in foster care hits 18, they're an adult and they're on their own. And if they want to go to college, they have to do this without any sort of support system in place for them. So what this organization does is it helps them with tuition, it sets them up with people that they can communicate with on a regular basis if they need help with something, and it sends them 3 care packages a year. Like, I don't know if any of you have college students, but you, as a parent, you probably get emails from the university saying, oh, if you want to send your kid a care package at finals week, you can do that. And or you could just send something on your own and send something to your kids, send them some cookies or send them, you know, a gift card to Target or whatever. And so that's what this organization does. They send them these care packages that have snacks in them or gift cards to Target or coffee shop or something like that. And then at Valentine's Day, they also send them a scarf. It's a red scarf. It could be any shade of red. It could be burgundy. It could be a scarf that includes red in it, but there's red somewhere in the scarf. And you're supposed to knit them in a unisex style. And I'll put a link down below. But when I first heard about this project, that was something that I felt like, oh, I felt driven to do that because I had a kid in high school who was going to be going off to college in a couple of years. And it was just something, you know, I had never been aware of, that, oh yeah, if a kid ages out of foster care and then they're on their own and having to navigate all that just would be really overwhelming. So that really struck for me. So when I heard that one of these remaining projects of Karen's was this unfinished scarf for the Red Scarf Project, I was completely happy to do that, not only for that particular charity, but then for Karen, who I only met one day, but who was a really amazing woman. And it also ties into this knitting group that I'm in, to this knitting community. So all of those things together, you know, would drive me to want to do this. And something that I want to keep in mind going forward, that there's some gifts that knitters can only give each other, that anyone can give a knitter a ball of yarn or a pattern or something like that. And a knitter could make a hat for somebody, but one knitter may not want to receive a completed hat for themselves, but they might really appreciate, if they can no longer knit, they might really appreciate another knitter helping them complete the projects that they want to knit, whether it's for charity or for a loved one, a grandchild that's on the way, something like that. So that's something I really want to keep in mind, that there are some really specific gifts that I can give to other knitters that other people can't give to them. So it's a way to help me keep things personal and do things that that are helpful and bring me joy, and as well as the other people. So this is just something that I'm going to keep in mind going forward, is that I'm part of a knitting community, and looking out for the other knitters in my community is part of what motivates me and is important to me. And I want to make sure that I help out my fellow knitter whenever I can. That's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.